The former is a technological roadmap for creating the conditions necessary for ascent into singularity, the latter is a book about life-prolonging technologies that will assist baby boomers in living long enough to see the day when technological immortality is achieved. See what I meant about his being a Heinlein hero. I still don't know if the singularity is a spiritual or a technological belief system. It has all the trappings of spirituality, to be sure. If you are pure and kosher, if you live right and if your society is just, then you will live to see a moment of rapture when your flesh will slough away leaving nothing behind but your ka, your soul, your consciousness, to ascend to an immortal and pure state. I wrote a novel called Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom where characters could make backups of themselves and recover from them if something bad happened, like catching a cold or being assassinated. It raises a lot of existential questions, most prominently, are you still you when you've been restored from backup? The traditional AI answer is the Turing test, invented by Alan Turing, the gay pioneer of cryptography and artificial intelligence who was forced by the British government to take hormone treatments to cure him of his homosexuality, culminating in his suicide in 1954. Turing cut through the existentialism about measuring whether a machine is intelligent by proposing a parlor game, a computer sits behind a locked door with a chat program, and a person sits behind another locked door with his own chat program, and they both try to convince a judge that they are real people. If the computer fools a human judge into thinking that it's a person, then to all intents and purposes, it's a person. So how do you know if the backed-up you that you've restored into a new body, or a jar with a speaker attached to it, is really you? Well, you can ask it some questions, and if it answers the same way that you do, you're talking to a faithful copy of yourself. Sounds good. But the me who sent his first story into Asimov's 17 years ago couldn't answer the question. Write a story for Asimov's the same way the me of today could. Does that mean I'm not me anymore? Kurzweil has the answer. If you follow that logic. Then if you were to take me 10 years ago, I could not pass for myself in a Ray Kurzweil Turing test. But once the requisite uploading technology becomes available a few decades hence, you could make a perfect enough copy of me, and it would pass the Ray Kurzweil Turing test. The copy doesn't have to match the quantum state of my every neuron, either. If you meet me the next day, I'd pass the Ray Kurzweil Turing test. Nevertheless, none of the quantum states in my brain would be the same. There are quite a few changes that each of us undergo from day to day. We don't examine the assumption that we are the same person closely. We gradually change our pattern of atoms and neurons, but we very rapidly change the particles the pattern is made up of. We used to think that in the brain, the physical part of us most closely associated with our identity, cells change very slowly, but it turns out that the components of the neurons, the tubules and so forth, turn over in only days. I'm a completely different set of particles from what I was a week ago. Consciousness is a difficult subject, and I'm always surprised by how many people talk about consciousness routinely as if it could be easily and readily tested scientifically. But we can't postulate a consciousness detector that does not have some assumptions about consciousness built into it. Science is about objective third-party observations and logical deductions from them. Consciousness is about first-person, subjective experience, and there's a fundamental gap there. We live in a world of assumptions about consciousness. We share the assumption that other human beings are conscious, for example. But that breaks down when we go outside of humans, when we consider, for example, animals. Some say only humans are conscious and animals are instinctive and machine-like. Others see human-like behavior in an animal and consider the animal conscious, but even these observers don't generally attribute consciousness to animals that aren't human-like. When machines are complex enough to have responses recognizable as emotions, those machines will be more human-like than animals. The Kurzweil singularity goes like this: computers get better and smaller. Our ability to measure the world gains precision and grows ever cheaper. Eventually, we can measure the world inside the brain and make a copy of it in a computer that's as fast and complex as a brain, and voila, intelligence. Here in the 21st century we like to view ourselves as ambulatory brains, plugged into meat puppets that lug our precious gray matter from place to place. We tend to think of that gray matter as transcendently complex. And we think of it as being the bit that makes us us. But brains aren't that complex. Kurzweil says. Already, we're starting to unravel their mysteries. We seem to have found one area of the brain closely associated with higher-level emotions, the spindle cells, deeply embedded in the brain. There are tens of thousands of them, spanning the whole brain, maybe 80,000 in total, which is an incredibly small number. Babies don't have any, most animals don't have any, and they likely only evolved over the last million years or so. Some of the high-level emotions that are deeply human come from these. Turing had the right insight: base the test for intelligence on written language. Turing tests really work. A novel is based on language. With language you can conjure up any reality, much more so than with images. Turing almost lived to see computers doing a good job of performing in fields like math, medical diagnosis and so on, but those tasks were easier for a machine than demonstrating even a child's mastery of language. Language is the true embodiment of human intelligence. If we're not so complex, then it's only a matter of time until computers are more complex than us. When that comes, our brains will be model-able in a computer, and that's when the fun begins. That's the thesis of spiritual machines, which even includes a Heinlein-style timeline leading up to this day. Now, it may be that a human brain contains n logic gates and runs at x cycles per second and stores z petabytes, and that n and x and z are all within reach. It may be that we can take a brain apart and record the position and relationships of all the neurons and subneuronal elements that constitute a brain. But there are also a nearly infinite number of ways of modeling a brain in a computer, and only a finite, or possibly non-existent, fraction of that space will yield a conscious copy of the original meat brain. Science fiction writers usually hand-wave this step. In Heinlein's Man Who Sold the Moon, the gimmick is that once the computer becomes complex enough, with enough random numbers, it just wakes up. Computer programmers are a little more skeptical. Computers have never been known for their skill at programming themselves. They tend to be no smarter than the people who write their software. But there are techniques for getting computers to program themselves, based on evolution and natural selection. A programmer creates a system that spits out lots, thousands or even millions, of randomly generated programs. Each one is given the opportunity to perform a computational task, say, sorting a list of numbers from greatest to least, and the ones that solve the problem best are kept aside while the others are erased. Now the survivors are used as the basis for a new generation of randomly mutated descendants, each based on elements of the code that preceded them. By running many instances of a randomly varied program at once, and by culling the least successful and regenerating the population from the winners very quickly, it is possible to evolve effective software that performs as well or better than the code written by human authors. Indeed, evolutionary computing is a promising and exciting field that's realizing real returns through cool offshoots like ant colony optimization and similar approaches that are showing good results in fields as diverse as piloting military UAVs and efficiently provisioning car painting robots at automotive plants. So if you buy Kurzweil's premise that computation is getting cheaper and more plentiful than ever, then why not just use evolutionary algorithms to evolve the best way to model a scanned-in human brain such that it wakes up like Heinlein's Mike computer? Indeed, this is the crux of Kurzweil's argument in Spiritual Machines. If we have computation to spare and a detailed model of a human brain, we need only combine them and out will pop the mechanism whereby we may upload our consciousness to digital storage media and transcend our weak and bothersome meat forever. Indeed, this is the crux of Kurzweil's argument in Spiritual Machines. If we have computation to spare and a detailed model of a human brain, we need only combine them and out will pop the mechanism whereby we may upload our consciousness to digital storage media and transcend our weak and bothersome meat forever. But it's a cheat. Evolutionary algorithms depend on the same mechanisms as real-world evolution: heritable variation of candidates and a system that culls the least suitable candidates. This latter, the fitness factor that determines which individuals in a cohort breed and which vanish, is the key to a successful evolutionary system. Without it, there's no pressure for the system to achieve the desired goal, merely mutation and more mutation. But how can a machine evaluate which of a trillion models of a human brain is most like a conscious mind? Or better still, which one is most like the individual whose brain is being modeled? It is a sleight of hand in Spiritual Machines, Kurzweil admits. But in The Singularity is Near, I have an in-depth discussion about what we know about the brain and how to model it. Our tools for understanding the brain are subject to the law of accelerating returns, and we've made more progress in reverse engineering the human brain than most people realize. This is a tasty Kurzweilism that observes that improvements in technology yield tools for improving technology, round and round, so that the thing that progress begets more than anything is more and yet faster progress. Scanning resolution of human tissue, both spatial and temporal, is doubling every year, and so is our knowledge of the workings of the brain. The brain is not one big neural net, the brain is several hundred different regions, and we can understand each region. We can model the regions with mathematics, most of which have some nexus with chaos and self-organizing systems. This has already been done for a couple dozen regions out of the several hundred. We have a good model of a dozen or so regions of the auditory and visual cortex, how we strip images down to very low-resolution movies based on pattern recognition. Interestingly, we don't actually see things, we essentially hallucinate them in detail from what we see from these low-resolution cues. Past the early phases of the visual cortex, detail doesn't reach the brain. We are getting exponentially more knowledge. We can get detailed scans of neurons working in vivo, and are beginning to understand the chaotic algorithms underlying human intelligence. In some cases, we are getting comparable performance of brain regions in simulation. These tools will continue to grow in detail and sophistication. We can have confidence of reverse engineering the brain in 20 years or so. The reason that brain reverse engineering has not contributed much to artificial intelligence is that up until recently we didn't have the right tools. If I gave you a computer and a few magnetic sensors and asked you to reverse engineer it, you might figure out that there's a magnetic device spinning when a file is saved, but you'd never get at the instruction set. Once you reverse engineer the computer fully, however, you can express its principles of operation in just a few dozen pages. Now there are new tools that let us see the interneuronal connections and their signaling, in vivo, and in real time. We're just now getting these tools, and there's very rapid application of the tools to obtain the data. 20 years from now we will have realistic simulations and models of all the regions of the brain, and we will understand how they work. We won't blindly or mindlessly copy those methods, we will understand them and use them to improve our AI toolkit. So we'll learn how the brain works and then apply the sophisticated tools that we will obtain, as we discover how the brain works. Once we understand a subtle science principle, we can isolate, amplify, and expand it. Air goes faster over a curved surface. From that insight we isolated, amplified, and expanded the idea and invented air travel. We'll do the same with intelligence. Progress is exponential, not just a measure of power of computation, number of internet nodes, and magnetic spots on a hard disk. The rate of paradigm shift is itself accelerating, doubling every decade. Scientists look at a problem and they intuitively conclude that since we've solved 1% over the last year, it'll therefore be 100 years until the problem is exhausted, but the rate of progress doubles every decade, and the power of the information tools in price, performance, resolution, bandwidth, and so on doubles every year. People, even scientists, don't grasp exponential growth. During the first decade of the Human Genome Project, we only solved 2% of the problem, but we solved the remaining 98% in 5 years. But Kurzweil doesn't think that the future will arrive in a rush. As William Gibson observed, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. Sure, it'd be interesting to take a human brain, scan it, reinstantiate the brain, and run it on another substrate. That will ultimately happen. But the most salient scenario is that we'll gradually merge with our technology. We'll use nanobots to kill pathogens, then to kill cancer cells, and then they'll go into our brain and do benign things there like augment our memory, and very gradually they'll get more and more sophisticated. There's no single great leap, but there is ultimately a great leap comprised of many small steps. In The Singularity is Near, I describe the radically different world of 2040, and how we'll get there one benign change at a time. The singularity will be gradual, smooth. Really, this is about augmenting our biological thinking with non-biological thinking. We have a capacity of 1026 to 1029 calculations per second (CPS) in the approximately 1010 biological human brains on Earth, and that number won't change much in 50 years, but non-biological thinking will just crash through that. By 2049, non-biological thinking capacity will be on the order of 1 billion times that. We'll get to the point where biothinking is relatively insignificant. People didn't throw their typewriters away when word processing started. There's always an overlap. It'll take time before we realize how much more powerful non-biological thinking will ultimately be. It's well and good to talk about all the stuff we can do with technology, but it's a lot more important to talk about the stuff we'll be allowed to do with technology. Think of the global freak out caused by the relatively trivial advent of peer-to-peer file sharing tools. Universities are wiretapping their campuses and disciplining computer science students for writing legitimate, general-purpose software. Grandmothers and 12-year-olds are losing their life savings. Privacy and due process have sailed out the window without so much as a "by your leave." Even P2P's worst enemies admit that this is a general-purpose technology with good and bad uses, but when new tech comes along it often engenders a response that countenances punishing an infinite number of innocent people to get at the guilty. What's going to happen when the new technology paradigm isn't song swapping, but transcendent superintelligence? Will the reactionary forces be justified in raising the whole ecosystem to eliminate a few parasites who are doing negative things with the new tools? Complex ecosystems will always have parasites. Malware, malicious software, is the most important battlefield today. Everything will become software, objects will be malleable. We'll spend lots of time in VR, and compute-thought will be orders of magnitude more important than biothought. Software is already complex enough that we have an ecological terrain that has emerged just as it did in the bioworld. That's partly because technology is unregulated and people have access to the tools to create malware and the medicine to treat it. Today's software viruses are clever and stealthy and not simple-minded. Very clever. But here's the thing. You don't see people advocating shutting down the internet because malware is so destructive. I mean, malware is potentially more than a nuisance. Emergency systems, air traffic control, and nuclear reactors all run on vulnerable software. It's an important issue, but the potential damage is still a tiny fraction of the benefit we get from the internet. I hope it'll remain that way, that the internet won't become a regulated space like medicine. Malware's not the most important issue facing human society today. Designer bioviruses are. People are concerted about WMDs, but the most daunting WMD would be a designed biological virus. The means exist in college labs to create destructive viruses that erupt and spread silently with long incubation periods. Importantly, a would-be bioterrorist doesn't have to put malware through the FDA's regulatory approval process, but scientists working to fix biomalware do. In Huxley's Brave New World, the rationale for the totalitarian system was that technology was too dangerous and needed to be controlled. But that just pushes technology underground where it becomes less stable. Regulation gives the edge of power to the irresponsible who won't listen to the regulators anyway. The way to put more stones on the defense side of the scale is to put more resources into defensive technologies, not create a totalitarian regime of draconian control. I advocate a $100 billion program to accelerate the development of anti-biological virus technology. The way to combat this is to develop broad tools to destroy viruses. We have tools like RNA interference, just discovered in the past 2 years to block gene expression. We could develop means to sequence the genes of a new virus. SARS only took 31 days and respond to it in a matter of days. Think about it. There's no FDA for software. No certification for programmers. The government is thinking about it, though. The reason the FCC is contemplating trusted computing mandates, a system to restrict what a computer can do by means of hardware locks embedded on the motherboard, is that computing technology is broadening to cover everything. So now you have communications bureaucrats, biology bureaucrats, all wanting to regulate computers. Biology would be a lot more stable if we moved away from regulation, which is extremely irrational and onerous and doesn't appropriately balance risks. Many medications are not available today even though they should be. The FDA always wants to know what happens if we approve this and will it turn into a thalidomide situation that embarrasses us on CNN. Nobody asks about the harm that will certainly accrue from delaying a treatment for 1 or more years. There's no political weight at all. People have been dying from diseases like heart disease and cancer for as long as we've been alive. Attributable risks get 1,000 times more weight than unattributable risks. Is this spirituality or science? Perhaps it is the melding of both, more shades of Heinlein, this time the weird religions founded by people who took stranger in a strange land way too seriously. After all, this is a system of belief that dictates a means by which we can care for our bodies virtuously and live long enough to transcend them. It is a system of belief that concerns itself with the meddling of non-believers, who work to undermine its goals through irrational systems predicated on their disbelief. It is a system of belief that asks and answers the question of what it means to be human. It's no wonder that the singularity has come to occupy so much of the science fiction narrative in these years. Science or spirituality, you could hardly ask for a subject better tailored to technological speculation and drama. Wikipedia, A Genuine Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, minus the editors, originally published in the anthology At the End of the Universe. April 2005. Mostly harmless, a phrase so funny that Adams actually titled a book after it. Not that there's a lot of comedy inherent in those two words, rather. They're the punchline to a joke that anyone who's ever written for publication can really get behind. Ford Prefect, a researcher for The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, has been stationed on Earth for years, painstakingly compiling an authoritative, insightful entry on Terran geography, science and culture, excerpts from which appear throughout the H2G2 books. His entry improved upon the old one, which noted that Earth was, simply, harmless. However, the guide has limited space, and when Ford submits his entry to his editors, it is trimmed to fit. What? Harmless? Is that all it's got to say? Harmless. One word. Ford shrugged. Well, there are 100 billion stars in the galaxy, and only a limited amount of space in the books, microprocessors, he said. And no one knew much about the Earth, of course. Well, for God's sake, I hope you managed to rectify that a bit. Oh yes, well, I managed to transmit a new entry off to the editor. He had to trim it a bit, but it's still an improvement. And what does it say now? Asked Arthur. Mostly harmless, admitted Ford with a slightly embarrassed cough. FN. My lifestyle is as gypsy and fancy-free as the characters in H2G2, and as a result my copies of the Adams books are thousands of miles away in storages in other countries, and this essay was penned on public transit and cheap hotel rooms in Chile, Boston, London, Geneva, Brussels, Bergen, Geneva again, Toronto, Edinburgh, and Helsinki. Luckily, I was able to download a dodgy, rekeyed version of the Adams books from a peer-to-peer network, which network I accessed via an open wireless network on a random street corner in an anonymous city, a fact that I note here as testimony to the power of the Internet to do what the guide does for Ford and Arthur, put all the information I need at my fingertips, wherever I am. However, these texts are a little on the dodgy side, as noted, so you might want to confirm these quotes before, say, uttering them before an Adams true-fan. And there's the humor. Every writer knows the pain of laboring over a piece for days, infusing it with diverse interesting factoids and insights, only to have it cut to ribbons by some distant editor. I once wrote 30 drafts of a 5,000-word article for an editor who ended up running it in 3 paragraphs as accompaniment for what he decided should be a photo essay with minimal verbiage. Since the dawn of the Internet, H2G2 geeks have taken it upon themselves to attempt to make a guide on the Internet. Volunteers wrote and submitted essays on various subjects as would be likely to appear in a good encyclopedia, infusing them with equal measures of humor and thoughtfulness, and they were edited together by the collective effort of the contributors. These projects, everything to H2G2, which was overseen by Adams himself, and others, are like a barn raising in which a team of dedicated volunteers organize the labors of casual contributors, piecing together a free and open user-generated encyclopedia. These encyclopedias have one up on Adams's guide. They have no shortage of space on their microprocessors. The first volume of the guide was clearly written before Adams became conversant with PCs. The ability of humans to generate verbiage is far outstripped by the ability of technologists to generate low-cost, reliable storage to contain it. For example, Brewster Kahl's Internet Archive project archive.org has been making a copy of the web. The whole web, give or take, every couple of days since 1996. Using the archive's Wayback Machine, you can now go and see what any page looked like on a given day. The archive doesn't even bother throwing away copies of pages that haven't changed since the last time they were scraped, with storage as cheap as it is, and it is very cheap for the archive, which runs the largest database in the history of the universe off of a collection of white box commodity PCs stacked up on packing skids in the basement of a disused armory in San Francisco's Presidio. There's no reason not to just keep them around. In fact, the archive has just spawned two mirror archives, one located under the rebuilt Library of Alexandria and the other in Amsterdam, FN. Brewster Kahl says that he was nervous about keeping his only copy of the repository of all human knowledge on the San Andreas Fault, but keeping your backups in a censorship-happy Amnesty International watchlist state and/or in a floodplain below sea level is probably not such a good idea either. So these systems did not see articles trimmed for lack of space, for on the Internet, the idea of running out of space is meaningless. But they were trimmed, by editorial clicks, and rewritten for clarity and style. Some entries were rejected as being too thin, while others were sent back to the author for extensive rewrites. This traditional separation of editor and writer mirrors the creative process itself, in which authors are exhorted to concentrate on either composing or revising, but not both at the same time, for the application of the critical mind to the creative process strangles it. So you write, and then you edit. Even when you write for your own consumption, it seems you have to answer to an editor. The early experimental days of the Internet saw much experimentation with alternatives to traditional editor-author divisions. Slashdot, a nerdy news site of surpassing popularity, FN. Having a link to one's website posted to Slashdot will almost inevitably overwhelm your server with traffic, knocking all but the best provisioned hosts offline within minutes. This is commonly referred to as the Slashdot effect, has a Baroque system for community moderation of the responses to the articles that are posted to its front pages. Readers, chosen at random, are given 5 moderator points that they can use to raise or lower the score of posts on the Slashdot message boards. Subsequent readers can filter their views of these boards to show only highly ranked posts. Other readers are randomly presented with posts and their rankings and are asked to rate the fairness of each moderator's moderation. Moderators who moderate fairly are given more opportunities to moderate, likewise message board posters whose messages are consistently highly rated. It is thought that this system rewards good citizenship on the Slashdot boards through checks and balances that reward good messages and fair editorial practices. And in the main, the Slashdot moderation system works FN, as do variants on it, like the system in place at cur5hin.org, pronounced corrosion. If you dial your filter up to show you highly scored messages, you will generally get well-reasoned, or funny, or genuinely useful posts in your browser. This community moderation scheme and ones like it have been heralded as a good alternative to traditional editorship. The importance of the Internet to edit itself is best understood in relation to the old shibboleth. On the Internet, everyone is a slushreader, FN. Slush is the term for generally execrable unsolicited manuscripts that fetch up in publishers' offices. These are typically so bad that the most junior people on staff are drafted into reading and, usually, rejecting them. When the Internet's radical transformative properties were first bandied about in publishing circles, many reassured themselves that even if printing's importance was de-emphasized, that good editors would always be needed, and doubly so online, where any mouth-breather with a modem could publish his words. Someone would need to separate the wheat from the chaff and help keep us from drowning in information. One of the best capitalized businesses in the history of the world. Yahoo! Went public on the strength of this notion, proposing to use an army of researchers to catalog every single page on the web even as it was created, serving as a comprehensive guide to all human knowledge. Less than a decade later, Yahoo! Is all but out of that business. The ability of the human race to generate new pages far outstrips Yahoo's ability to read, review, rank and categorize them. Hence Slashdot, a system of distributed slushreading. Rather than professionalizing the editorship role, Slashdot invites contributors to identify good stuff when they see it, turning editorship into a reward for good behavior. But as well as Slashdot works,